Hello, I'm Leah Markey, Director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program on Zoom, on YouTube, and on Facebook. The Newberry is an independent research library in Chicago with collections spanning more than 6 centuries of human history in Europe and the Americas. We've been free and open to the public since 1887. Recently, we reopened our doors to readers and visitors. You can visit our website to make a reader appointment, or you can drop by the library without an appointment Tuesday through Friday afternoons to see our 2 fall exhibitions, Renaissance Invention, Stradonnis' Nova Aperta, and Decision 1920, A Return to Normalcy. Today's program and the conference that follows over the next 10 days represents the result of a collaboration with the Folger Institute in Washington, D.C. I wish to thank Kathleen Lynch, Executive Director of the Folger Institute, and her Farm to Table team for sharing this project with us in the Center for Renaissance Studies. Kathleen will now say a few words about the project and introduce the program.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you to the team from the Center for Renaissance Studies. We are collaborating on this program because of Leah's generous offer to host a conference in partnership with the Folger. We needed a partner because the Folger Shakespeare Library has recently closed our doors to readers and visitors. It's only temporary. We will reopen in the fall of 2022 after an important renovation to our landmark building on Capitol Hill. And we're busily planning a new suite of programs and capacious new spaces for exhibitions, seminars, workshops for the casual visitor, the student class, or the researcher. This conference, back to today and this event, this conference is part of Before Farm to Table, Early Modern Foodways and Cultures. That's a multi-year collaborative research initiative funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and we are deeply grateful for that support. This project has enabled us and it's challenged us to think about food in history and food in practice, to draw connections between the past and the present, and to bring different kinds of audiences together to think about all the ways and all the reasons food nourishes us or doesn't. Professor Goldstein represents our core team of co-directors and postdoctoral fellows on the organizing committee of this program. You will meet all the members of this team over the course of these next couple of days. Goldstein is Associate Professor of English at York University in Canada. He is the author of Eating and Ethics in Shakespeare's England. He's extending that work in a current book project, With Whom We Eat, Literature and Commensality, with the support of a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council grant. As a poet and a former restaurant critic and journalist, David brings many skills and wears multiple hats in moderating this session today. Over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thanks to Leah for contributing to the beautiful organization of this conference and of this panel. So we're starting out this 2-week conference with a public panel, which is really a conversation, Cooking by the Book, a conversation with chefs and authors. And I'd like to welcome to this virtual table Michael Twitty, who is the author of The Cooking Gene and the creator of Afro Culinaria, the first blog devoted to African-American historic foodways and its parent traditions in Africa, the African diaspora, and its legacy in the food culture of the American South. Also, something you may not know is that he just got married yesterday, and we are so happy for him, and congratulations. I'm also thrilled to welcome Tamar Adler, a chef, contributing editor at Vogue magazine, and the author of An Everlasting Meal, and most recently, Something Old, Something New, Oysters Rockefeller, Walnut Souffle, and other classic recipes revisited. Welcome, Tamar. I'm also very happy to have here with us Paul Fehribach, the chef and co-owner of Big Jones Restaurant in Chicago, and the author of The Big Jones Cookbook, Recipes for Savoring the Heritage of Regional Southern Cooking. Excuse me. And finally, all the way from Germany, we are really pleased to be welcoming Irina Dumitrescu, a writer whose essays on food have garnered many, many honors, including being featured in Best American Essays, and who is professor and head of English Medieval Studies at the University of Bonn. Welcome to all of you. So the way for our audience, the way we're going to approach this conversation is I just have a general question to ask us all to start out, and everyone's going to talk about it, a few minutes each, 5 minutes each, and then we'll have some more follow-up questions, and we will then open it up for questions and answers from the audience. So we're really looking forward to hearing from everybody. So all of you, Michael, Tamar, Paul, Irina, work at the intersection of cooking, writing, and research in some way or other, as authors, as chefs, as restaurant owners, as interpreters of food culture, as scholars, as activists, and maybe above all or below all, as inveterate readers of old cookbooks and other texts about food. So the basic question here is, why does reading these old texts matter? We're at the beginning of a conference on the relationship between food and the book from 1300 to 1800. Who cares? Why should we care? What do we learn from these books, and why should people, ourselves, our students, our customers, our listeners, our guests, our readers, why should they care about them too? Michael, let's start with you. What are you thinking about that? You're still muted.
Sorry.
And now you are not.
No, I am not. So the first thing I have to contend with is the fact that text, that word is weird, because what if you come from people, as I do, who had a primarily oral tradition, and then all of a sudden in this, period of time, I mean, the Atlantic era, we like to start at Columbus, but Columbus didn't start the fire, as it were. It starts about 200 years before, the ship starts sailing. And it's because Europe is invested in trying to find sources of gold and other resources that it doesn't have. And so it goes to the Middle East and it goes to Western Africa. People should know that it didn't start in 1492 or 1500. It started when the caravels and people started traveling southward. Columbus gets his start in West Africa, not in the West Indies or even in the Mediterranean. So let's start there. And so the recipes and people and energies that I work with start in that time period. And then we have to get these ancient ideas about food, which are always in flux, and they're always moving and changing, on paper. And they get on paper via the influence and the agency of people that don't look like me. And then the other text isn't written text. It's the lived text. So in order to write a cooking gene, I couldn't just go to everybody thinks that, you can just go to some book and they're all the slave recipes or the Black recipes, the West Indian recipes. There's not. There are, however, pieces of written documentation of how people behaved. Notations on foodways that are tucked into texts about people who were in the slave trade or who had witnessed slavery, or people who lived the life of enslaved people or of free African people themselves. And then what you have to do is you have to sort of sew that together with the lived tradition that you come from, plus the mosaic pieces of recipe text, which are foreign to us, because improvisation is a huge part of what we are, and traditions that were never meant to be written down. People think that if it's important, it should be written. But in the context of a lot of sub-Saharan African people, not writing it down is the key. So the secret is with you and your people like especially your mother, your grandmother, your father, your grandfather, your uncles, your other relatives. So the secrecy part. So that I say all of that to say that when I do my work, it's always a question of, so especially now, especially in the past 6 or 7 years, this question of evidence, authenticity, verification. How do you do that when you don't have the same resources of the people? How do you make a case for something being scholarly and authentic and true when you are not working with those same pieces? So for me, to sum up, it's become a situation where I have to sew all those pieces together. I have to go into ethnography, and I have to go into cultural anthropology as a whole, and I have to go into archaeology, ethnobotany. I have to go into oral history and folklore. I have to go into textual analysis. I have to go into multiple languages. The fact that there are pieces of African languages that are engaged in the evidence that we have that people have never thought to look at because they don't understand and they never thought to engage that. So it's an interesting journey trying to make sure that people understand that a recipe is not just a formula, it is a spell. It is magic. It is also a fumbling piece of tradition that always changes. I like to close with a joke. It's related. It's the brisket. It's the brisket theory. You know, there once was a lady who made a brisket, and she always cut it in half. And she thought, okay, great, this is part of the technique. And then when she went to interrogate her mother said, I don't know why we cut it in half. My mother did that. So she goes to Bubby and she goes to interpret it. And Bubby says, I cut it in half because the pan wasn't big enough. So it's a blend of the answers right in front of your face with all sorts of other phenomenon that we're not privy to. And somehow you make it through and you make your analysis the best you can.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, that's great. Tamar, you want to take it up?
Yeah, first I want to say I would basically be fine with Michael just answering the questions and doing the talking, because he just, yeah, Michael, you just did in a couple of minutes what I've been struggling with so in such like an anxious way for a few days, because I've been finding this question so hard. And I, as everybody who was on our preparatory call knows, I've been completely hung up on the questions that you just pretty gracefully kind of resolved. And my problem has been how, why does this, the question, why does this matter to us? I have been feeling like for a few days, I've been really stuck in the question of, does it matter at all? And how do we use words like we and matter and author and text when all human orders of representation are fictions and language is itself a colonizing act? And we know that, right? That that I was reading Wendell Berry to kind of help me with this. And he was writing that, to put things into language, we are excluding other things, right? We're always being surprised in creating history and creating anything that we put into words or into images. We're always finding out that to create it, we've had to exclude something. And that's sort of the nature of our symbolic orders. And so I've really been wondering whether the right thing to do at this moment is to stop fetishizing recipes of the past, which I think I certainly have. I've been wondering what kind of fiction I've been participating in reading the culinary history that I have known about in my 43 years as a Jewish woman growing up in the Northeast, and how much I've been reinforcing the erasures and exclusions of that tradition just by my engagement with culinary history. And if my culinary history has, not mine, but if the culinary history that I have written about and studied exhaustively has been part of a really hurtful, is upheld by hurtful erasure, then to what degree can it possibly be useful? And how can its study be useful? And I was really struggling with this, even in our last call and in emails I've had with David. And then I realized I was getting caught in a trap. And that the trap I was getting caught in was the trap of abstraction. Because while it is true that a lot of the culinary history that I have studied erases, it also does something else, which is that it ties the universal to the specific. It ties the universal to the present. And I was thinking it was a weird way that I got there, but I had this line echoing in my head from Anne Carson, the beginning of Anne Carson's autobiography of Red. And there's a place where she says that adjectives, but it also means language. She also means language attaches everything to its place in particularity. And I was realizing that what is universal, the way we feel the universality of eating, feeling hungry, cooking, and serving, is very much in our feeling of it, which doesn't happen while you're eating, but tends to happen when you engage in some way in a representation of that, whether reading it. When you read somebody write, all humans eat, all humans are hungry, you feel something. And it's in that feeling, which is mimetic, it's a mimetic experience, it's representational. It's one of those representational orders. That's where the universality comes in. So that by denying the specific orders, the attaching of the abstract to the specific, I wasn't doing anybody any good. But that allowing for that specificity and really a kind of embracing the places in our culinary writing where those specifics have been present and have helped people to evoke human experience. I could potentially do what you just said, Michael, which made me this was like the main clarifying thing, which is think of it as sewing things together, right? As a patchwork. And I happened and you said patchwork and you said mosaic and you said sewing things together. And one of the issues I really take with a lot of contemporary recipe writing and recipe text is that it is so abstract that it takes you away from any possibility of specificity, of particularity. And I happened to be reading a New York Times cooking food letter this morning, and there's nothing wrong with the recipe that I'm about to cite, but it asks you for basil sliced and then torn, and one small shallot and raisins, ideally yellow. And I was picturing, and 2 small Italian eggplants. And I was just thinking, wow, there is nothing universal in that, right? Like you're in the universal supermarket in some abstract situation where you can just find eggplants of a certain size, no matter where you are, and yellow raisins. I mean, what? Like, what? It just takes away everything that is universal and human. And that one of the things that I have to really embrace in a lot of old recipes is, I say old recipes, again, knowing I'm engaging in a canonization and fetishization of a Eurocentric culinary canon that I know. But there exists a humanity and a specificity to some written experience that is not there now. And I'm going to stop, but thankfully I was looking at Anne Carson to find that line about attaching things to particularity, and I kept on reading, and she describes the fragments of the Garianis poem by Stesichorus at the end. And she says, it read as if Stesichorus had composed a substantial narrative poem, then ripped it to pieces and buried the pieces in a box with some song lyrics and lecture notes and scraps of meat. And I thought, if we could think of each of us, everybody who reads and cooks and serves, if we thought of what we treasure in any previous text, whether like text as what we think of as text, or text kind of figuratively as lived experience, as stuff, fragments in a box and scraps of meat, with so much missing, right? Like it's not a scroll, it's not a parchment, it's these fragments. Then I can begin to understand how it is not, if we think of it as undone and as not a canon, but something to be kind of engaged, and us as the kind of seamsters and seamstresses, it seems a worthier endeavor than it felt like to me 2 days ago.
Thank you. Wow, that's really thought-provoking, and hopefully we'll dig into it some more. Paul.
Yeah, I'm going to start actually maybe more in the present day or recent times and sort of work backward in my interest in historic culinary texts began really when I read The Taste of Country Cooking by Edna Lewis, which was a book that changed my life. And I was, about 45 years old, no, about 42 years old when I read that book, and had been cooking for nearly 20 years in the restaurant business. I own my own restaurant by then, and I just really felt robbed when I read this book because it spoke to me in a way that no other cookbook had. The humanity of it, the sort of the universality of food as giving you a sense of place, a sense of family, a sense of community, and also the time of year. That was the first cookbook that I read where the narrative was seasonal, and where all of the recipes, the menus, everything was seasonal. And this is like, the early 70s, I think. And which was absolutely revolutionary. So she sort of started the concept of farm to table. She was before Alice Waters, she was before everybody. Yet it's only been in recent years that her story has been told, and that she's being recognized as being as influential as she was, and still is, and will continue to be. But I sort of read that book and I thought to myself, wow, this is how I really want to cook. And it saved me in a way, because I was miserable cooking what I was cooking at the time. But I thought, this is how I really want to cook. I want to cook seasonally. I want to cook from the land. I want to cook like my ancestors would have cooked. I want to gather food like my ancestors would have gathered, and have that sort of that continuation of time between generations. And food is one of those things through the sense of smell primarily, but also taste, where you can identify with, generations of history. You can see the same sights, you can smell the same smells and taste the same tastes. It's a powerful way of connecting with your ancestors. But when I started looking for other cookbooks that would maybe give me an eye into cooking seasonally, they didn't exist. Even, 2000, this is in 2008, 2009. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go look for books that maybe were written before people had refrigerators and all of that kind of stuff. So I sort of started looking for the oldest cookbooks I could find. And the first thing that struck me was that, I think what, as this discussion has been a little bit, is sort of the erasure of the people who were creating these recipes and writing these texts. And, these texts are all about the woman of the house. And it's sort of reflective actually of modern culinary culture, where you might have a white male chef and, he writes a book and the book is all about him. And it's not really about the history, and it's not an honest narrative about everyone that is involved in the backstory, and not everyone's welcome at the table. It's all about me. So, I think we learned something about how to write. We do learn how to cook seasonally. We learn what to do with quinces, and nectarine pits and all sorts of other strange things that we don't even really think about anymore. But we also sort of start to realize, well, this is not an honest way to tell a story, because you're erasing all of these people that are involved in it. And then you find these interesting glimpses, like the Kentucky housewife, where Lettuce Bryan actually mentions the help, or Dishes and Beverages of the Old South, which is the only reference I can think of in which the help was actually talked about in a favorable light, and actually in a very sentimental light. And sort of think about how at least those two books begin to wrap other people into the narrative. And it sort of gave me a glimpse into, and what I hope I did in my book and in my next book, is to, sort of maybe wrap myself into a narrative, or be a part of a narrative and a big table in which when we tell a story, that we are honest about it, first of all, and that we include everyone's story in an honest and forthright way. And I guess I think I liked Michael's point about cookbooks as appropriation in that way. And when you're writing any text, let's talk about text as appropriation. When you write any text or you tell any story, there is that danger, and you have to kind of go back and say, well, I'm and sort of walk in that person's shoes and walk that person's walk, in order to sort of bring their story to the table in an honest way, and really to let people tell their own stories is I think the most important thing that we can do, and maybe the most important thing that we can learn from these old texts, as interesting as the recipes are.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I can see all three of these comments kind of taking shape around a couple of central issues and concerns. Thank you. Irina.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether to start in the 21st century or the 13th century, which is usually my problem, but I want to think through some of the issues that have been brought up. I am not a scholar of food. I am a food memoirist who reflects on what it's like to be an immigrant at this point 4 times over. My supermarket is always the wrong supermarket for all of my recipes, right? Having watched my father really try to hold on to a sense of his identity through pickling and making wine and making really kind of illegal hard alcohol in our garage in the suburbs of Toronto. And so when I have to say, when I read recipes, it's very hard for me to read recipes as representing a thing. For me, recipes represent a desire, a longing. And you have, one of my bookcases of cookbooks is there, and I wouldn't even be able to cook most of the things in it because I wouldn't be able to get the ingredients where I am, right? And I think just thinking about recipes in terms of hunger and actual hunger, right, which is many of us no longer feel very often, but which I think for most of human history has been something that every single human being, really no matter the class, had to be at least aware of, right, had to at least think about what happened when a crop was bad, right, what happened when 2 years' crops were bad, and what that meant for all of society and for the relations within the society. So hunger, but I think also longing for a sense of self or a sense of identity. Often class aspiration, right, is tied to some collections of recipes. So I was going to tell you about a 13th century poem, but actually what I want to mention is a 20th century collection of recipes that was never really meant to be cooked. It's a collection of recipes that was written down from memory in Terezin or Theresienstadt in the ghetto. Cara de Silva, a wonderful friend, edited this. It's available as a book called In Memory's Kitchen. I bought it in the cookbook section of Half Price Books in Dallas many years ago, which is really not where it belongs, because the recipes were written by women who were starving to death, right? They don't work as recipes, right? The manuscript was written by a woman called Mina Pechta. She passed, I think in 1944 on Yom Kippur, but she managed to get it out, and it was eventually brought to her daughter and eventually edited for publication. And What I find so moving about this collection of handwritten recipes is that they're being written down in a context of starvation, and the point of them is not to cook them, right? The point of them is to hold on to something, right? To hold on to something human, to hold on to a sense of cultural identity, of personal identity, simply to survive, right? And Cara has told me a lot about this quite frequent phenomenon we see, and she's found in a lot of literature. I've found it too in prison memoirs from Romania from the 1950s, where people will cook with their minds, right? They will tell stories about delicious meals they've had. They will tell each other recipes. I've been told in Auschwitz, people yelled recipes out to each other, right? And I kept coming back to these texts, especially this year, when so many people turned instinctively to craft, but also to bread baking, to pickling, food preservation, to cooking at home, partly out of necessity, because sometimes the restaurants weren't open or still aren't open. But there was something so powerfully instinctive about the sense that this is something we can do to hold on to our humanity when nothing is normal anymore, right? With that in mind, when I go to medieval literature and look at not just recipes, but also depictions of food and eating, what I find is so much hunger. I hadn't realized before how much hunger there is in medieval texts, hunger for knowledge, but also quite simply starvation or fasting or various kinds of physical hunger. And so I think I also have trouble thinking of these recipes as something that tell me anything like the truth. When my students cook them, they realize they're not dealing with any of the same ingredients. The spices are not the same, the chickens are not the same, the apples are not the same. They cannot cook these recipes and imagine for themselves that they're eating a medieval meal. All they're doing is an exercise in humility, right? But I think we can learn a lot about hunger from older texts.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Excuse me. As we move into to expanding on all of those fascinating issues that everyone's brought up, I want to say to everyone who's listening and watching that if you want to start if you have questions you want to put into the Q&A section of the webinar, please do, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible a little later in the discussion. So, you know, I'm really struck by the ways in which all of you have sort of been talking about what Irina just summed up as reading as an exercise in humility. That we all, you know, as soon as we say, hey, what are texts good for? Our answer to them is, wait, what's a text and what's good for, and what's reading, and how do these things, what are their deep relations to ourselves, and to both the universal and the particular in human experience. I was thinking as I was listening to some of you about, you know, when I open a 17th century recipe book, I'm always instantly humbled in the sense that I often can't read them at all. I usually have no idea who wrote it, because most of these don't have authors, or they have multiple authors, or the authors don't correspond to the people who are writing them. It's not clear how the recipes came to be, where they come from. But then in between all of these questions are these hard facts, like a recipe book that interleaves recipes with, in one case, a diary that describes an awful and tragic miscarriage. And there are ways in which lives penetrate and interweave, to use that sewing metaphor again, with the experience of these recipes or of other kinds of food texts that make it very difficult to see them as stable in any way, right? And so I very much take Tamar and Michael's point that thinking about this as a kind of box of fragments or of scraps of meat that you have to, it doesn't give you anything. You know, that gives a responsibility, I think, to the interpreter, a very profound responsibility to the interpreter of any text, written, oral, visual, to make something of it that honors, as Paul was saying, those lost stories or the invisible stories, and honestly responds to them. I wanted to actually kind of take things in a little bit of a different direction while I've been thinking about the challenges that you guys have been describing, and ask whether this operation of reading and struggling with reading to make meaning, to tell stories in an honest way, changes in the situation that we currently find ourselves in, the situation of being distanced socially, physically, in a time of this strange virus that both exacerbates inequalities and issues that were already there in our world, and also creates new ones. I mean, I hadn't mentioned at the beginning of the talk, like this was supposed to be in a physical space in the Newberry Library, and yet here we are, you know, circling the interwebs. And that has a direct impact, I know, for me on cooking and using food in my own life. I'm suddenly cooking for myself, for my immediate family. Everything is sort of shrunk down. The what Tamar in one of her books calls the strange and human invention of hospitality is fraught in some way by this separation. Can we turn to our kind of knowledge of these stories, our knowledge of these texts, in order to kind of reinvigorate those connections? Do they do any good for us? Do they allow us to kind of reestablish that particularity and that, you know, bring back connection or expose invisibility that Michael and Paul are directing us towards? Or are they of no use at all? Is this a situation in which you've got to kind of do it without the help of these prior texts that we would normally have turned to for various reasons? Anyone want to take that on?
I just had I just put up a piece on the New Yorker's website yesterday about, which I thought was going to sound more confessional than it did, but it really was a confession. And it was that in a way I really was surprised by and didn't quite understand myself. I went into a almost manic, really an almost manic spit of preserving this year. I always preserve things, but it was humbling in the sense that I could feel that I was doing what people have done for all of history. I felt it felt like a sympathetic connection with what people have done forever. And it was even the kind of preserving I was doing felt very kind of primal to me. I wasn't, normally I preserve because I entertain all the time, and I'm not entertaining. And I put up literally 60 pounds of cranberry beans. And I was too embarrassed to write some of what I did because I thought people would really send help. But a bushel and a half of corn and 2 cases of chilies. And I mean, this started in March. So it's also literally 20 pints of strawberry jam, blueberries. I mean, it just was like, and I could tell I was preparing, and it was this very primal act. And I think it falls into the realm of maybe what Michael was talking about as kind of the non, almost like the lived text, where I had to write about it, right? Because otherwise writing about it was sort of, I guess, part of the experience. Maybe telling people I was doing it, and if they're doing it, it's okay. Or maybe even that it's cathartic to do it. And if they feel a need to preserve more than their family can use, I get it, but it did feel, I felt helped by the pieces of the quilt that I have with me. And I did feel like my actions were part of that longer thing that I'm sure, you know, moms faced with a pandemic in history have probably dealt with as many beans as I have as a way of staving off something.
I want to kind of respond. You know, one of the biggest things that I heard people talk about, like my grandparents' era, was the Depression in food. And I remind people that Black people laughed at the Depression, especially in the Deep South, because we had already had a society where we had to hunt, we had to fish, we had to garden, we had to farm. Both of my grandmothers used to say, and they were very separate. They were not friends. Well, they said, and also different parts of the South, and one was a decade older or so, and they both said the words, during the hard times, the white people begged at our back door. That's a deep thing to say. And one of the things that you do when you do this stuff, and when it's everyday stuff versus like have to do it out of necessity or fear or hunger, it's a very different mentality. It's a mentality that you know you're going to be hungry, you know you're going to need, you know you're going to have to share, you know you that might be your only form of forming community with other people and bonding and keeping those connections tight. And also the power of expressing oneself through food. The power that, you know, when in the domestic sphere and beyond, when women particularly were creators and innovators, this is a layer and level of expression that they either took their power back through that, or they were allowed, and they did it to the umpteenth reason. You know, it's kind of like when we have in our tradition, other tradition, Tejinas, right? These prayers that were said over challah and chillant and all these things, because that's the way of expressing in that moment, that spiritual power, the idea of having those gates of heaven open because you cooked something with love, you know, all that. And then the other level, to Tamar's point, is you know, I was thinking about waste. So the joke was on me because I put this out there social media. How can I stop wasting food? And then I realized 80% of the responses were, I put it in a plastic bag, I freeze it, and I make it, it's gonna be stock later. And I'm like, okay, great. Then I looked at my freezer and I said, oh my God, I already did that. I have how many things of stock or onion pieces do I already have? Y'all didn't tell me nothing. This is not a surprise. This is not a miracle. It's just, okay, great. What do we do beyond stock cubes, guys? What do we do beyond that? And it's a way of connecting with the people of the past, but also with each other, and also trying to find out. It's like we're having this huge virtual potluck that doesn't end. And it's just like, oh my God, how many hot dishes and soups and another I mean, it's got to be something beyond that, you know, something. Especially now, y'all got air fryers and air dryers and all that nonsense. So yeah, it's there's something I didn't think about this before, but there's something primal, there is something ancestral, there is something responsive that we're doing all this, and for what? Irina said it. We're not living medieval or World War hungers, not the same way. We have neighbors who do, and let's not ever forget that. Let's ever forget that, or forget that our world has a really big problem with answering to hunger when it obviously can. But most of us eke out a way. Yeah.
Or Irina, do you want to address that, or should we move on?
I have to say, I love everybody's bread photos. I think that's why the sense of the massive potluck. I'm not sick of seeing everybody's bread photos. I think that the strange thing is, as silly as it is and as performative as it is, when we can't meet each other and we can't provide hospitality, that's actually really brutal. My parents, I grew up with the stories about standing in line for hours in the freezing cold for a potato that wasn't there, right? But the culture I was born into still has hospitality. It didn't matter how little you had. You could lay out a meal and you would make the person suffer. You would stuff them with food, right? You would guilt them into eating to the point of collapsing, right? And that was how you expressed love and sociability and your values. And we can't do that right now. So I think there is actually something quite beautiful, as Michael was saying, about this massive digital sharing. And as imperfect as recipes are, and we might not have all of the ingredients, recipes are transferable. It's the thing we can give. We can say, okay, cook this thing if you have all of these lentils and you don't know what to do with them anymore, right? This is actually what we can give to each other right now.
Yeah, I love that suggestion of the big potluck. And I think that maybe the most interesting thing about the way the pandemic has transformed the way people are cooking at home and the way people are behaving around food themselves at home is the way it's sort of affected the social media feeds and that concept of the big potluck, in that it's made, pre-pandemic, the social media feed tended to be about, restaurant meals, this, that, and made food like this glamorous thing. Everybody was trying to have like this really glamorous feed when it came to what they were eating and drinking. And it's become a lot more personal, the things that people are sharing, because they're involved in these deeper projects. The sourdough, became a meme almost instantly. And that is, and people would sort of take you through this whole process and this whole story in a way that they just wouldn't do before. And they're preserving projects and all of the things that we're doing that we just never did because we've got time on our hands and we long for that sense of community. So everybody's coming together around these things on social media, and it is become kind of this big potluck or big table. And it's really fascinating. And I think I like to think that it's maybe permanently changed the conversation around food that we're having in this country, and maybe that things will be more personal going forward.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I love the idea of thinking of, the texts we need now as being the sourdough bread meme. Like that's what we need to hold on to is the kind of conversion to the digital of how we would share food in a kind of practical, physical way. I've also been wondering about whether the fascination with sourdough partly has to do with the fact that the virus is this kind of thing that's moving through the air in a scary way. Sourdough replaces that with the beautiful yeast that's moving through the air in a positive way that then feeds us and nourishes us. Is there some kind of, cosmic counterbalance in a kind of, like to think of things as kind of germs and anti-germs? I don't know. Just throwing that out there. You do not need to respond. So we have tons of questions coming in, so I'm going to move to those. And I'm going to start with this one. I'm wondering at the fact that so far, none of the panelists have spoken about pleasure, and maybe in particular, the pleasure of recognition that is an integral part of any food tradition, and it's creating/recreating cultural identity. Could you comment on this? So no need for everybody to comment, but if you want to, please do. Anybody want to?
Yeah,
Michael?
Quickest version I can. I mean, I've had a really hard time convincing folks in the African American community part of myself that my work on digging up the foods and recipes and traditions of enslavement are an essential part of excavating the psychology of Black joy. There's everybody if the average response about what a soul food is, some Black people took some scraps that someone threw at them and made it into something delicious. That's total nonsense. Absolute nonsense, especially after coming from West Africa. I've been to West Africa now 7 times, 8 countries in 3 years. And I see the roots of soul food and traditions all over the place in a very still challenged West Africa. And the people there don't go, someone threw something at us. They go, not only we make the best of what we have, but we appreciate seasonality, taste, flavor. We make jokes about life, death, sexuality, rebirth, renewal through our food. We teach. I've seen 9-year-olds make whole meals, and I've seen aunties and grandmothers make feasts for thousands. I've seen men bring in antelope from the rainforest, and I think about all the analogies I heard of and saw with my own eyes from my parents and grandparents and other relatives in Deep South. And I go, no, this is about Black joy. This is about us celebrating each other and celebrating ourselves. And the last comment on that, Alice Walker had the most amazing line in The Color Purple. She said, on July 4th, white folks celebrate independence and Black people celebrate each other through barbecue. And it was just like, yeah. So yes, to the question, absolutely. The joy of not just the marginalized and everybody else, but everybody has this joy thing through food. And sometimes it's implicit and sometimes it's not.
Yeah, I think particularly when we're talking about pre-1850 texts, the concept of pleasure doesn't really shine through in, at least in what I've read with cookbooks and such. And then we wind up, if we're talking about joy or the concept of joy or cultural identity, that's a very sort of malleable concept. And I think Michael made that point very aptly. It's interesting that, when I look at West African cooking to the limited extent that I have, that those roots of American soul food are there. And so you have these concepts and these things that people hold on to over generations that are dear, and they may change because time and place are malleable as well, and they're going to be influential. But as far as ascribing joy to them goes, it really is a matter of that cultural identity. But how you identify yourself is very much ascribed to where you're from, and again that concept of taste and smell, the senses that bind you to your ancestors and also sort of allow you to live in the present in a joyful way. And the barbecue is a really beautiful concept. We called them pig roasts when we were growing up, and you'd have them in the fall when pigs were first slaughtered at the onset of cold, and they were always these really memorable and festive events. But we don't read about these in old culinary texts. People weren't writing about the food and foodways of common folks in 1750, and so we're left with, and Michael's, I think, the master of this in using intuition and scholarly research to sort of go back and put those aspects of culture together and be able to bind them to the present.
Could I just add a small note? I think we really actually have to fight for pleasure, because at least, Western European and North American culture, the dominant cultures, offer a lot of options for identifying yourself or for shaping your own identity through denial, right? I'm going to deny myself this. I'm not going to put that in my body. I'm not going to put that in my body. And I'm certainly not going to feed that to my kids, right? And so I think there is something, maybe revolutionary is too big of a word, maybe not, but I think that's something we actually have to get over. Some of us, I don't want to suggest that I mean everyone with we, but some of us have to get over certain mental hurdles to focus on the pleasure, because choice is valued, What kinds of choices do I make? What kind of a person do I prove I am through my choices? But giving pleasure to other people and giving pleasure to yourself doesn't have as robust of a discourse. Let's put it that way.
Tamar, do you want to chime in?
I feel like we're still on question 1, and I want to make sure that people get heard.
Well, we might be able to like slip in one more question, but we could also just end on pleasure, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. So if you have something that you're mulling over, might as well share it.
I mean, I'm glad that, you know, I'm glad that the asker brought it up, because my instinctive response whenever somebody asks me why I read old recipes and old culinary texts is because I love them. And I didn't answer that to this question because there are so many more important things to interrogate. But hearing what Irina said made me realize that all the problems have to coexist with love of text. And the fact that I love, you know, reading Bartolomeo Shappi and can do it for hours just to read about him writing about partridges can coexist with the fact that the enshrinement of white male authors has, to a great degree, erased all the people who actually made food through all of human history. Those things can coexist, and I find myself fighting in my writing and in my personal relationships all the time with the various ideas of health and holiness that seem to go along with abstinence, because I find them so rejecting of life and humanity. And I think it's actually a useful moment to think about holding more than one thing in our minds at once.
Right. If I may respond, I put something out to the group, but the audience can't hear it or see it. And it was, you know, don't forget that a lot of these text, especially Western text, are the people we come from saying, I'm cooking for someone else. You know, it wasn't, and everybody likes to think that somebody got a little like doggy bag if you were poor or enslaved or a woman or whatever, or a serf in the back in the kitchen. They didn't always happen that way. We really have to, in fact, there's some pretty horrifying torture devices that were made specifically to keep the people who were cooking from eating that saffron, ever tasting those cakes. I mean, this is fascinating. But the other part of it is that, you know, a lot of these pleasure, okay, so the people who are engaging in pleasure through this food, they're not always writing their responses, but the architects of the food are talking about it, but it's for somebody else. We always have to remember that. There's always been this performative, hey, look at us, this is great. But the majority of people don't enjoy that. But like Paul said, and like Irina said, and like Tamar said, you know, I like hearing, okay, I'm going to say this, David, I got to say this really quickly. Okay, great. So people will come to me and they'll be like, oh, you got a one-pot meal if I'm doing historic interpretation of enslaved people's food. Or I'll make something and they go, okay. They expect, I don't know what they're expecting, but I wish they could come to me every day for 3 months. And every day I make hoe cakes and salt herring, hoe cakes and salt pork, right? And they go, okay. But on day 45, they see I have a fried rabbit and some greens and they go, oh my God, fried rabbit and greens. And they go, wow. And I said, now you get it. Now you know what it's like to live that serf, that peasant, that third world thing. And then all of a sudden you get this one little reprieve that 20 people have to share. And now you have a tiny bit of the feeling that most of the world throughout all of our history, even to this day, lives with. So joy and pleasure are relative.
They're relative and they're also tenuous, right? I mean, this goes back to In Memory's Kitchen, what Irina was mentioning. There can be pleasure in all kinds of hardship, right? But finding it and holding on to it and distinguishing it can be incredibly difficult given a particular situation, a particular, raft of difficulties, right? Pleasure's got to be there, but it's tenuous. It's powerful because it's tenuous, I think. Thank you guys so much. I really, really appreciate this conversation. You're wonderful. It's a real treat to be here with everybody. We thank you very much, our participants, our audience members, for listening and for contributing your questions. Sorry we didn't get to more of them, but there were some really wonderful ones. I'm going to turn this over to Leah to wrap it up for us. And again, thanks to Michael and Tamar and Irina and Paul for contributing your time and your thoughts.
And thank you to David for organizing this whole roundtable. It's been a beautiful conversation, and special thanks to the Folger Library and the Mellon Foundation for their support. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. A recording of this program will be available on YouTube very soon. I know many of you had questions about books that the panelists talked about, and so we're going to work together with them to create a bibliography of the books they spoke about and other books they might recommend, and we'll put it online. We'll probably put it as an attachment on the conference website, so stay tuned for that. It's very appropriate for our conference entitled Food in the Book. Remember that Newbery programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. And during this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. Please make a gift to the Newbery today by visiting newbery.org/give. And to all of those of you who are registered for our Food in the Book conference, we look forward to seeing you online this afternoon and throughout the next days. We will be starting up the conference at 1:15. I also wanted to make sure that you all know that you should join us next week on Monday, October 12th, for another public program to conclude the conference, which is focused on Indigenous foodways, past and present. I should note that the Zoom reservation is completely booked, but we will also be streaming it live to Facebook and YouTube, so you can catch it there. So those of you who want to stay online over the next minutes will get to see us setting up for the next conference panel. We'll officially start the conference, as I said, at 1:15 with opening remarks by the organizers. So thanks again for everybody for being here.